whole scale is massive. When the Pope speaks from the balcony in front of St. Peter's, he has to stand up on a stepladder to see above the balustrade. It's 8 feet tall. The church itself is tremendous in scale. Slide, please. The whole thing is still based on Roman antiquity. The pilaster pediments, the arched windows, the broken arch pediments, the little triangular pediment, very reminiscent of Greek temples. Of course, the dome is purely Renaissance. Slide, please. And then looking down into the tremendous area, these columns that surround the colonnade are 8 feet in diameter, each one, and they're a set of 4 deep within each colonnade. The tremendous obelisk in the center is surrounded by 2 large fountains on either side. Again, there's a pattern of symmetry. Even the whole area laid out, city planning, was done according to a perfect proportion. Slide, please. And the main altar, the interior within the transept of St. Peter's, as I said, the vaulted ceiling rises 150 feet from the floor. The baldacchino over the main altar, strictly Baroque, where you have all of this ornamentation, the movement, the sort of writhing form, which then brings in the 16th and 17th century Italian school. Slide, please. And the Pope's altar, which is one of the smaller side altars. All of this is gold leaf. Notice the use of the pilasters, the columns, the indication with the striping, and then the flat capital, which is purely decorative in the Corinthian style. Slide, please. Slide, please. Even to the point of using the Latin carving. But you can check the date on this one. 1461, I believe. Slide, please. And then the severity of some of the style in the contrasting use of the stone. Slide, please. Clear the machine.
The series this semester, beginning with the Egyptians, working chronologically up through Renaissance architecture, I thought apropos would be a mixed-up review of all the cultures that we've studied so far. Slide. Okay. What is this? Huh? Romanesque. Romanesque. It's not Renaissance. Romanesque is very heavy. Now, after the lecture today, the Renaissance, remember, although they did do interiors, and it was a lot of arches, it was basically a compositional type art effort where they designed the things. Everything was sort of along a facade. It was almost like a painting or a stage set. In the churches, where you have the central nave, the Romanesque churches, again, both of them were derived from the Roman art. The Romanesque took the Roman arch. It was basically church architecture, whereas Renaissance architecture was not only churches, but palaces, hospitals, public buildings, and everything. But the Romanesque architecture is very heavy, but it is of this plan of the 2 side aisles with the rounded arches and the very heavy columns holding up the central nave, roof, walls. Slide. What is this one? This is just plain Roman. It's a true Roman victory arch, where the Romans then introduced the arch to architecture, being able to span greater areas by the use of the arch. And this was one of their commemorative things that then the Renaissance architect then used this this form very much in the Renaissance architecture. Slide. What is this? Archaic Greek. The stiff figure, the frontal pose, weight equally balanced on both feet. Slide. What is this? Okay, I hear Byzantine over here. Why is it Byzantine? It is Byzantine because of all the mosaics on the interior, for one thing, the decorative quality about it, the many sort of little abutments, the openings. It's a very rich, it's a very decorated interior of Byzantine. This is St. Mark's in Venice. Slide. What is this? Aegean. The utilitarian pottery utilizing nature designs as decoration. Slide. Classic Greek. The stylization of the face, it's much more natural. They don't have to have the archaic smile anymore. The figure is at rest. Slide. Mesopotamian, the use of the relief bricks and ceramic glazes. The overall pattern, lots of pattern and design to Mesopotamian work. Slide. Early Christian, the two forms were the tomb paintings and depicting stories of Christianity, and the coffins, the sarcophagi that had the carvings on them that also told the Christian story. Slide, please. The Erechtheum in Athens. The use of the Ionic columns. This isn't a symmetrical temple. This was used as a treasury. Slide. Egyptian, again, with stylization in a certain way that's used. This is the one of the images of King Tut. Slide, please. Okay. This is Romanesque again. Church architecture, the many use of the arches. A little on the decorated side with the fretwork on the arch. Slide. Mesopotamian, again, the very powerful man-beast form that they used on the city gates. The heavy, massive beard, which denoted great strength, but a delicacy to the patterning in their designs. Slide, please. Aegean, the Cycladic figure, the female fertility figure. Slide, please. Renaissance. All right, if you start looking at it, it starts to get a look to it. It is the composition of the face of a building, of how they decorate it, how they design it, how they divide it. And just like the Romans, even on the Colosseum, they will use different orders. Like to the building to the right, the broken pediments used on the first floor windows, the rounded arch pediment on the second floor windows, and a straight pediment on the third floor windows. But everything's symmetrical. Every little hole is balanced by a matching hole on the other side of the building. Slide, please. Etruscan, the tomb paintings, very lyrical, curving lines depicting interests of the person who is buried there. Slide. Okay, and upside down, but stained glass, medieval. Stained glass is medieval. Early Christians, you didn't have stained glass down underneath the ground in the catacombs. Slide. Egyptian, again depicting the life of the Pharaoh. Slide. Okay, this is Gothic. Remember, the pointed arch is Gothic. The rounded arch in churches would be Romanesque. But the Gothic became very decorative. Slide. Adam and Eve would depict early Christian. You would not have any Christian symbols in Etruscan work. Slide. Roman. Slide. Renaissance. Again, the symmetry, the pattern, the almost like perspective was refined, or the rules of perspective were set down during the Renaissance. And you have almost the rules of perspective in the courtyards with the, you can follow to the vanishing point. And it's always, it seems, one point perspective. Everything's set on a parallel base angle in Renaissance work. Slide. Aegean, the beehive tombs, the elliptical arch opening. Slide. Byzantine. Busy Byzantine. Lots of stuff going on, lots of domes, lots of decoration. Slide. Greek, one of the orders, the Doric order. Slide. Medieval, the manuscripts, the illuminated manuscripts were medieval. Slide. Roman, the introduction of portraiture. Instead of only gods and heroes, the ordinary average person with all their blemishes were done in stone and in painting in the Roman art. Slide. Mesopotamian, the lion hunts of the kings. Slide. Archaic Greek. This is one of the early ones where it's almost purely geometric. And then they started with the introduction of figures. Slide. Gothic, the pointed arch. Gothic is very vertical, very up, pulling your eye upward toward heaven. And they used the pointed arch so they could get this more vertical feeling. Slide. Egyptian, one of the temples, the interior courtyard, with the plant life as the motif for the top of the column. Slide. Roman. Their interior wall paintings either depicting scenes from mythology or garden scenes or still lifes, things like that. Slide. Remember, Gothic is a form of architecture. And in the Gothic period, you had what kind of art? Medieval art. And this is one of the tapestries. Slide. Aegean, the tapered columns with the mushroom caps. Slide. Etruscan, one of the reclining figures on the sarcophagi. Slide. Classic Greek, natural figure, although idolized, is at ease. Slide. Mosaics would be Byzantine. Slide. Okay, clear the machine. This is the end of the semester review for Art 2A. We have covered a wide range of time and periods in this class so far, starting 3000 BC with the early Egyptian tombs, paintings, and artwork, and bringing it up to Renaissance architecture. Next semester we will continue with the Renaissance, but studying individual artists rather than the culture of the period. In the Egyptian, well, in all of the cultures, we have broken it down into three major areas: their architecture, if any is existing. There's sculpture and the decorative arts, which would include tomb paintings, jewelry, furniture, etc. We had two basic forms of the Egyptian architecture. Basically, the pyramids or the tombs. It began with an early step pyramid and then was refined with the elegant pyramids of the Old Kingdom. You also had temples that were used for worship, and these were sort of interior or enclosed courtyards where the masses met, and then as your position got higher, then you went into smaller and smaller areas. The columns, it was basically a post and lintel type construction. In other words, you built two columns and you put a lintel or span across the top of the two columns, and that way you could cover the roof area. The columns were usually based on some sort of nature form, like a bunch of papyrus reeds tied together. The tops might be a lotus blossom, but they would be decorated with hieroglyphics telling the story of the pharaohs. Slide. In all of the Egyptian art that we have, it was to glorify the pharaoh, not of his life, but to continue his life after life. A place for the Ka, or the spirit, to find a home. So there were many reproductions of the face of the pharaoh or the body of the pharaoh, and many of his utilitarian objects from his household would go into the tomb with him. The tombs were painted, the wall paintings decorating it, flat surface pattern, very stylized, the head usually in profile, the body full forward, to be sure and show all the limbs of the figure, using earth pigments and against almost sort of, not exactly a fresco, but painted against plastered walls. Slide. And in their sculpture, as I mentioned, it would be a place for the spirit, for the soul to rest in the afterlife. Again, you have the very highly stylized, although the different pharaohs catch different sort of individual characteristics of the person. This is of Queen Nefertiti. Slide. Then the second culture that we had was more eastern, and it was from the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and it was the Mesopotamian cultures. They were a warring, violent culture, and their art forms were very delicate. Even with the massive beard, where they show the tiny little delicate curls that together in repetition creates a very forceful, powerful statement of masculinity on the model. The muscles were outlined, defined, but overall the decoration is basically very delicate. Slide. We don't have much of the architecture. All we have left are some gates. They were covered with a glazed ceramic relief brick work, and it showed either figures or animals, but it was in relief and then set up in brick pattern, but glazed like a ceramic glaze. Slide. And you also had in the Sumerian culture of the Mesopotamians the figures in the temples with the wide, large eyes that were the windows of the soul. And these, like the Gudea with his hands crossed in reverence, guarded the temple and were the stand-ins for the people when they weren't there. The temples were large piles of debris and dirt that were called ziggurats, and they built them extremely high, but being not of a permanent material, only just some excavations of the bases are left today. Slide. Okay, in the Aegean culture, we had two forms of architecture. One of them, the beehive tombs, which were large rock forms in sort of an elliptical shape, shaped like a beehive. If you've ever seen one of the sort of straw woven beehives, it's an elliptical shape. This is why they're called beehive tombs. They also still work on the post and lintel form of construction. And in the beehive tombs, you have the massive stones that are laid up with a massive lintel that goes across the doorway, and then sort of a triangular opening above it, or a pediment, that was then filled with sculpture. The other form, the Palace at Minos, had the type of architecture. The only characteristic form was the tapered columns, which were made of wood. These are all reproductions today. And they had sort of a balloon cap or a mushroom cap, and these were painted bright colors. Slide. Also in the Cyclades Islands, we have these small, carved usually from limestone and very abstract, but fertility goddess symbols. Probably 2 feet would be the largest any of these would be. This one's a little more in the round, although some of them were very flat, but very abstract, very simplified, but they were the female forms. Slide. And then in their pottery, you have sort of a fanciful decoration on the pottery, usually based on nature themes, either plant forms, leaves, or animal forms, like some jugs have an octopus on them, or birds, or shells, or something of nature. But they were useful pottery. They were not used for any funerary purposes like the archaic Greek later on would be. They were terracotta and decorated in oxide colors. Slide, please. In the Greek pottery, it is for a different purpose, and it was placed over graves filled with oil so that the oils would slowly seep down to the body buried below. The early pot, and they were more symmetrical than the Aegean. They usually had the 2 handles. It was an amphora type vase, and the earliest ones were pure rings of geometric designs. And then later on, in some of the geometric designs like this, you would have the sort of silhouette lozenge type figure, but everything is completely planned in advance. All the areas are taken care of. The rings of patterns meet up and they fit into place. There's nothing spontaneous about an archaic Greek vase. Slide. And then in the archaic Greek figures, you have the male, the choros, which was a nude figure that was of some funerary purpose, and the female, which was usually clothed, also for an offering. Usually the hand was, although broken off now, was usually bent forward, offering, making some sort of offering. But the figure is freestanding, standing in space, but weight equally placed on both legs. Slide. Then in the architecture, you have the development of the 3 orders: the Doric, of which this temple is built; the Ionic, which is a little more feminine and slender; and the Corinthian, which the Greeks very seldom used, but was much more decorative. It was like an inverted bell shape decorated with acanthus leaves. And the Romans picked that form up as their more favorite one. But the Greek temple is usually of beautiful proportion, of a certain key, a mathematical key, that the whole building would be based on. And it was prettier on the outside because very few people were allowed on the inside. So the mass of people came to the outside to worship. Slide. In the classic Greek sculpture, you have the idealized head, of where the forehead and the nose flow in one straight line. The curls are usually stylized to form a tousled look of the hair, but they're all sort of neatly coiffured. The face does not show any blemish. The only people that were sculpted, that the Greek sculptor depicted, were the gods, the immortals, or possibly some athletes right at that moment of achieving immortality at the end of a race. Slide. And with the full figure, you have the figure in repose or in at rest, where the weight is then placed on one leg and the other leg is relaxed. Slide. In the Etruscans, you have basically two forms of art. The tomb paintings, which sort of depicted in a very lyrical, happy way some interest of the person whoever was buried there. You have sort of stylized divisions of the space. These were all small underground tombs. Small divisions of space like the stylized plant farm on the right. And then the figure over on the left side, even everything is sort of curving and upward. Even the pointed toes of the shoes down at the bottom sort of work upward in a positive manner. All the lines are sort of slightly curving. There are no harsh angles in Etruscan drawing. Slide. And then another sort of very fun thing is the coffin covers of where they had their portraits during their lifetime, usually, but they had their portraits in a reclining fashion, or semi-reclining fashion, made out of terracotta that rests on top of their coffins. And these would be in their homes as pieces of decoration. You have also a typical sort of Etruscan face in the man on the right with the sort of pointed or the spade-shaped beard. You still have, almost like the archaic Greek, you have slightly the bulging eyes and the archaic smile. But instead of the smile showing the presence of life, the Etruscans, you really have a feeling that the smile was sort of a happy smile. Not so much like the Greek, that they just had sort of a pasted smile on, but you feel a spirit of the Etruscans. Slide. Then with the Romans, the Etruscans were sort of to the Romans what the archaic Greeks were to the classic Greeks. In other words, the Etruscans were the early, in the northern part of Italy, in Tuscany, around Florence. These were the early Roman people. In Rome, the Romans developed the arch principle of building. This is what had stymied the Greek for so long. The perfection of the Greek could not allow them to introduce new methods of construction or architecture. So it wasn't until the Romans that they introduced the arch principle that allowed them to span greater areas and have much greater freedom in the placement of their columns or supports. They introduced many things, but they borrowed, of course. The Romans were the practical people. They weren't that much of the aesthetic mode, but they borrowed from all the other cultures and turned it into a very practical use of their own. Slide. And in their artwork, they decorated the interiors of their homes, their buildings, their baths, their meeting places, with decorations showing in mosaic. Now the difference of this would be that it is not the glass mosaic, but these are little stones, the natural colored stones. The Byzantines used the glass mosaic that gave the brilliance and a richness of color that these do not have. But they would depict scenes from mythology, and they would also do vistas of architecture, sort of like scenic wallpaper today, that would open up to a small inner room with this sort of visual vista. Slide. And they were great ones for analyzation. They would also do simple still lifes or garden scenes. And they introduced portraiture. The woman became very important in the Roman culture and more powerful than she had ever been in the Greek culture. So you have portraits both of men and of women, but they are individuals. They show how the face was constructed, from a skinny face to a rounder face, the different hairstyles. They have expression on their face. This the Greek would never have done. Slide. Then around 300, well, from AD to about 300 AD, you have the early Christian art. And the two basic forms that we have of that, again, are the paintings decorating the walls in the catacombs that told the story of Christianity, and also some very elaborate sarcophagi, or coffins, that held the bodies of the buried Christians. And these would be decorated in carvings, showing the stories of Christianity. The art form was based, of course, on the Roman or the classic Greek. But not having any teachers, all they could do was observe and be self-taught. So the figures usually, instead of being elegant, were sort of squatty, misproportioned, but the emotion was there in telling the story. Slide. And these the frescoes actually covering in the caves beneath the ground. They would plaster over the walls and then paint the frescoes. Slide. In the great breakthrough in architecture, Christianity came above ground about 300 A.D. with one of the Roman leaders who took on Christianity. And from that point on, the Roman Empire spread way to the east to Constantinople. It was almost a division. Constantinople was much more powerful than Rome at that time. And with Constantine, you have a really breakthrough in the building of Santa Sophia, which is now in Istanbul, but where he takes the arch form, but then breaks it off so that all the weight, the stress of the weight, is put to four corners rather than on the entire circumference of the dome. So you have a great opening, a great expansion of space, great use of domes. Highly decorative. Slide, please. And especially the interiors of the Byzantine churches, which were covered with these glass mosaics that told also stories of Christianity. But now these were pieces of glass, of colored glass, of a brilliant color that never fades, and they're set in grout or cement, and they create these beautiful pictures in the apse ends of the Byzantine churches. Slide. In the medieval period, which is over a long period of time, say from around 500 AD on up, some of it as late as 17th century, but the main part of it would be about from the years 1000, the 11th and the 12th centuries are the main parts of the medieval culture. This is where you have the castles, the building of churches. Now within the medieval culture, we have two forms of architecture, Romanesque and Gothic, and I'll get to those in a moment. But within the medieval culture, you have, like this, the Book of the Hours of the Duc de Berry, or his prayer book, with beautiful little illustrations. You have the introduction of stained glass. You have tapestries being woven, paintings being done, all sorts of relics, beautiful artwork in gold, silver. You have the book covers. You have the beautiful illuminated manuscripts. This would be the medieval art. Slide. Manuscripts that are written on parchment, and a lot of them had gold leaf decorations. These were large books, and only, of course, the monks would be able to, they were the only ones who could read them. Slide. And the beautiful stained glasses, tiny little pieces of stained glass put together with this lead casing that were then put in the cathedrals and in the windows. Slide. Now, within the form of the medieval culture, we have the first form of architecture, which is Romanesque. And just like it says, Romanesque means like the Romans. They took the arch principle. They're heavy, massive churches. They were usually a central nave with two shorter side aisles. You will have rounded arches in the Romanesque style of architecture. They're more massive, the columns are heavier, and it's usually of stonework too, and they're squattier, shorter. Slide. Then in the Gothic, which uses the pointed arch, they have the flying buttresses on the outside of the church that hold up the walls. They sort of counteract the outward push of the roof by the flying buttresses pushing the walls inward. It helps hold everything up. But with the flying buttresses and the pointed arch, they were able to open up the space between the columns and between the arches and install all the beautiful stained glass. Slide. Then the last part that we did was the Renaissance architecture. Now the Renaissance is about from 1450 to 1550, in that period of time. Most of it is in Italy. This was the high point of it. And they returned, like the Pazzi Chapel, they returned to Roman architecture and took measurements of Roman architecture because they felt it was so beautiful and the proportions were such a delight. And then they would translate it, though, into Christian buildings for the churches. And then it went on to public buildings and private homes. But they would take what the Greeks and the Romans had introduced, their proportions mainly, and then superimpose them on a facade of a building. I mean, you in no way know how the rooms are cut up inside this. In a Greek temple, you know pretty much what the interior would be. In this, you look purely at the building as if you were looking at a painting, a flat surface where everything is nicely divided, it's balanced, its composition was perfectly arranged. If you had one little window over here, you had to balance it with another little window over there. And in many times they would have like the different levels, just like the Romans did in the Colosseum, where they had the Doric columns on the first row, the Ionic columns on the second row, and the Corinthian columns on the third row. All right, they take that same idea, but then they use different, but always a self-repeating design. Like the windows will have straight pediments on the first floor. The second floor has every other one, a rounded one, a broken one, a rounded one, a broken one. And then on the third level, they're all broken pediments above the windows. But they think of this like in perspective of creating space, of creating an organized surface for the front of the building. And this is basically what Renaissance architecture did. Now, next semester when we get into the painting, it's sort of like what was going on inside these buildings, the intellectual thought of